Hi folks, you may not know this about me, or it may be super obvious, but I'm an introvert. I'm a fairly shy person. So on today's GM Diary, I'm going to be talking to you about kind of my tips and tricks of how I've dealt with being a shy, introverted, sometimes anxious person at the same time as being a GM, something that I think a lot of people look at as maybe needing to be a little bit more extroverted, a little bit more sure of yourself, and how you can kind of get over some of that anxiety and some of that nervousness and just jump in and do it. So all of these are just kind of my own personal thoughts. If there's stuff that works for you, great, go ahead, do it. But I figured I would share it, one, to let you know you're not alone if you are a fellow introvert out there who's looking into getting into GMing and maybe a little nervous about it, as well as just, hey, if any of the things that I found are helpful to you, I want to share them with you. So first of all, I think it's really important, especially if you have anxiety or any other kinds of issues like that, to sit down and figure out what are the things that trigger your anxiety, or what are the things that make you nervous. Knowing what those triggers are, you can try and work to avoid them, and also you can come up with coping mechanisms for if they do come up. So like for me, having plans change last minute makes me fairly anxious. And I know there are a couple of other things like caffeine, drinking a lot of caffeine. A certain level of caffeine is good, but if I tip over that scale and get too much, that just, it ramps up everything, so it makes me a little bit more susceptible to becoming anxious. I think it's also good to tell your players, to let your players know, hey, I'm a little nervous about this, or I'm not the most outgoing person, and they'll help you out. It's a collaborative thing, and you can ask for help. So along this line of asking for help, I have heard a lot of people talk about this, and I do it to some extent, but having players assigned to do certain tasks. So one thing you can do is ask one player, make sure you kind of assign it so you don't have a too many cooks in the kitchen situation, but one person that keeps track of initiative. That's something that having everybody shout out numbers as you're trying to prep all of the monster stuff and all the encounter and pull out the map, and it can get to be a lot. So being able to hand that task off to a player, one, it might speed up kind of moving into an encounter, and also it takes one thing off of your plate so you can concentrate on the other things. Similarly, you might assign one player to be the person that looks up a rule if there's a question during the game. I like to be the one to look at the rule and read it and make the ultimate decision. But one thing you can do is just say, hey, can you find this in the book for me? Because sometimes, especially depending on what system you're running in, the finding something in the book isn't always super straightforward, of like flipping to the back, finding the index, and then jumping to it. It might be referenced in a couple of different places, and you might have to flip to a couple different pages to find it. So that keeps things moving and takes a little bit of stress off of you. If you have a rules lawyer in your group, you might assign them to be the kind of, what is the rule, and then you as the GM make the ultimate decision. I will say with this, I think it's important that you make sure your players know that you as the GM will make the ultimate decision, or come up with the plan of, if there is a disagreement over how a rule works, how are you going to resolve that? Come up with a kind of a plan for that before it comes up in game. That way everybody's on the same page, everybody agrees, and it creates a little less conflict when that does come up. So the first time I ran a game, it was the D&D box set for 5th edition. So I was running a module. I also knew that it was only going to be a couple of sessions. So I think for me that was really nice. It was having a smaller commitment for GMing. So if I realized that I really didn't enjoy it, I hadn't already committed to a full year-long campaign. That being said, if modules you don't find interesting at all, you might find it a little bit less stressful to have a homebrew, because you can just make things up as you go and not have to worry about, oh, well, what if my players want to go in a different way than the module, or trying to adapt the module sometimes can be a little bit difficult. So it's, again, kind of thinking about it and figuring out what's going to be best for you. So also that first game, I was running with a group of folks that we had been playing in different systems, number of games. We hung out a lot for game nights. So I knew them, I knew what kinds of players they were, and I trusted them. And I think that's really helpful, especially until you get a little bit more comfortable with jamming, to have a group of people that you know already and play with, or that you at least have that trust of, I know your play style fits with mine, and I know you're a person I enjoy being with, because that's going to make it more fun. I personally would not want to have jumped into like running a campaign for strangers as my first thing. That seems like a bit too much. If that sounds fun for you, go for it. But again, knowing how far you want to push yourself, and once you get a little bit more confident with your jamming skills and all of that, you can start pushing out of your comfort zone and maybe run a game with folks at your local game store or at a convention, stuff like that. Kind of expanding and stretching yourself without, jumping out of your comfort zone too far to a point where it's a bad experience and you don't want to GM again. So here are some of the specific things that I do to make GMing a little less stressful for me. One, as I said before, I avoid caffeine. I'll have like, hey, I've got a cup of coffee here right now. So I'll have a little bit of caffeine, and I usually try and gauge like, when in the day are we gaming? Do I want to have a cup of tea or coffee during game? But I make sure that I also have non-caffeinated beverages. One, because you're going to be talking a lot, you want to keep your voice hydrated. But also then I have something that I will have a cup of coffee and then switch to something non-caffeinated, so that my caffeine levels aren't high enough that it's just the caffeine alone is making me feel anxious. The second thing that I do is I've come up with kind of a pre-game routine, I guess is the best word for it. Setting up the mat and pulling out the minis and setting up my GM screen, kind of getting everything all set up so that, and I do this an hour, 2 hours before folks are supposed to arrive, so that I feel prepped and all set, and if there is any last minute things that I need to do, I've got a little bit of time to do that. So I'm not feeling rushed about it. The couple of times that I've waited to do that until just before people have arrived, I've felt a little anxious going into game, and I think the games haven't been as good because I haven't been feeling my best. A big thing that I kind of remind myself before games is that things are not going to go as planned. And that's some of the really fun parts of GMing and of gaming, is that it can go wherever the players and the GM wants it to go. So while I plan things out, I've also learned to accept, like, if my players go on a different direction, great, awesome, I'll roll with that. And that's actually been kind of helpful for me in the rest of my life, kind of taking that and reminding myself in times when things aren't going as planned that that's okay, I can roll with it and come up with a new plan. I always make sure to give myself recovery time after gaming. Even as a player, I love gaming, but it takes a lot out of me. And especially as an introvert, you need I recharge by myself. So we often game on Saturdays, and I try to make sure that the Sunday after we're gaming, I don't have a lot of big things planned. If I've got a couple little things or errands I need to run, that's fine, but I'll just make sure there's not like a big event that I need to go to and be talking to a whole bunch of people, because I know I'm not going to get that recovery time. If it's like earlier in the day on Saturday, I'll just make sure I've got a couple of hours before doing anything in the evening. Just knowing that I need that recovery time, I think, has really helped to make both gaming enjoyable, and then moving on to other things, I have the energy for it. The final thing is I just committed. I finally said, okay, I'm going to do this, and I posted to our Facebook group and said, this is the plan. This is when I want to do it. Because for me, a lot of my anxiety comes over like that making the decision. And once I've made the decision, once I've committed to something, I'm like, okay, this is happening and I'll figure it out. So I think that's really helpful, coming up with a plan. And again, I think we've talked on this in several videos. Scheduling can be a major source of anxiety, but that's a whole separate issue. But committing to the fact of, I'm going to run the game, this is what I'm going to run, and let's go with it. And my final tip is to come up with a GM persona. And this is especially something that's helpful if you are really shy, if you're really nervous. Come up with a persona. Write up an NPC that is you as the GM, but make yourself not shy, make yourself not anxious or introverted, and then play that character. And I've done this kind of unaware in my life outside of gaming, where I've been like, okay, I'm thrust into a situation where I need to do something that is a little out of my comfort zone, and I've just looked at it and said, okay, in this situation, I'm going to pretend to be somebody who knows what I'm doing, or I'm going to pretend to be somebody who's outgoing and confident. And the more as you do that, that will kind of leak over, and you can start putting that persona away and coming back as just the GM. But you'll have had that experience, and because you're playing that persona, there's a little bit of kind of comfort of like, hey, I've got like armor on, so if something goes wrong, it's the GM's, problem, not necessarily my personal problem. And then as you get more comfortable, you can take pieces of that armor off. So I hope those tips were helpful. Even if you aren't an introvert or aren't shy, I hope you can use some of those tips to maybe make your jamming experience better, or just your gaming experience. I'm sure some of these tips could also be useful for players as well. So what are your tips for getting over anxiety or nerves about GMing? Do you have a specific routine that you go through? Do you have things that you avoid? Let's talk about it more down below. I want to give a thanks to all of our patrons, especially Sean, Joan, Arby, Lainey, and Bryce. If you're interested in helping support us, help us make more videos, you can go over to patreon.com/rollforinitiative and check out some of the perks that you can pick up while you're helping us out. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Roll for Initiative. Bye!